Interstellar exploration does not begin when you arrive at another star. It begins when you decide to slow down. Welcome to Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. Today, we're continuing our Fleet Unity series, as one of humanity's first interstellar colonization fleets nears the end of its journey from Tau Ceti, the first star system settled after leaving Earth, to 82G Eridani. These fleets take a very different approach to colonization than the classic single-destination colony arc. Instead of traveling to one world and stopping, they are designed to settle an entire star system, resupply, and then move on again. Part of the crew remains behind to build a permanent civilization in that system. The rest continue onward, beginning another multi-decade journey. Along the way, they rebuild, using raw materials harvested from the system they just settled to replenish equipment, expand habitats, and grow their population in transit. We explored this model in our previous episode, Fleet Unity, humanity's first interstellar armada. What began as a single ship, Unity, used its time in Tau Ceti to build itself larger and stuff its hull full of raw materials, then spent the next 80 years constructing dozens of additional vessels during the voyage to 82G Eridani. By the time it arrived, it was no longer a single ship, but an entire Gardner fleet, one that stops to see the system, then continues on. In this episode, we'll be joining the very first ships to arrive, a Vanguard squadron, sent ahead of the main fleet to establish a beachhead. This series started way back in 2016 with a single ship traveling to settle one of Saturn's many moons, and has worked its way out into the galaxy. It used a fictional interstellar expedition with somewhat mutable canon as a framework to explore the real science and engineering of starflight, colonization, and large-scale space infrastructure. The story is there to make the ideas stick and feel real, but as always, the ideas themselves are the point. For over a century, human dreams of the star's imagined arrival as a moment, a flash of light, a new sun filling the sky, a fleet dropping out of the dark to claim a future. But at relativistic speeds, arrival is not a destination. It's a long, expensive, and deeply consequential decision, one that has to be made decades in advance, with no possibility of revision once it's underway. As such, humanity did not arrive at Eridani all at once. It simply could not afford to. Someone had to go first. Someone had to accept the risk of arriving early, long before help, long before redundancy, and long before history could judge whether the choice had been correct. Someone had to prototype this new fleet slowdown method and establish a beachhead. That task fell to Vanguard Squadron, with its flagship, the Emissary, a small fish next to an enormous Unity, and the minnows that made up the rest of the squadron. As Fleet Unity prepares for its first slowdown burn, 70 years out from Tau Ceti on the Eridani expedition, 70 EE, this smaller force peeled away from the main armada, faster, leaner, and far less forgiving of error. Using momentum transfer, the Vanguard slowed the main fleet by roughly 0.1% of light speed, while accelerating themselves by far more, reaching 20% of light speed themselves, and with minimal propellant expenditure. Almost all of their mass was braking fuel and enormous, tightly packed mirror arrays, their human crews asleep for the journey. They would begin a crash deceleration midway through the year 77 EE, lasting just over a month and being just a few light days out from Eridani. The fleet, slowed to half its prior speed, would not arrive at the outskirts of the system until 87 EE, a decade behind the Vanguard. Their mission was not to settle Eridani, it was to make settlement possible at all. They would build the brakes, they would build the logistics, they would build the beachhead the rest of humanity would one day take for granted, and then, if everything worked, they would surrender command to the wider fleet as it arrived. But that handoff would only happen if their mission, the first of its kind, succeeded. Interstellar exploration begins when someone accepts responsibility without reinforcement. Authority at the end of a light year. The Commodore was convinced he still had ice in his veins when he arrived on the bridge of the Emissary to join the fleet's science officer and the deputy engineer in charge of the beaming array architecture. They looked entirely too cheerful for having emerged from cryosleep mere hours ago, but then he gathered he'd been on ice a bit longer than they had. Maybe that explained his bad case of cryo-itch. 70 years. Had only been that long for him. Plus the science officer had a mug of coffee. He always had a mug of coffee. the Commodore noted out loud as he sat down at the conference table with him. Not true, the science officer replied. I was drinking out of a bulb until we turned the engines on to warm them up in the primary reactor. I've been out of cryo longer than everyone else. Anyway, we're at half gravity now and we'll begin the burn at 2G once we finish checks. Alright, update me on the mission. 70 years is a long time to stay out of the loop, and my notes look like they were written by a committee that couldn't agree on the color of the sky. The deputy engineer smiled. The sky is black, sir, as always. But the why has changed. We aren't just slowing down, we're booting the brakes to the rest of humanity while we're still moving at 20% of light speed. And congratulations on your promotion, sir. She shared a brief look with the science officer. Both decided it was wise not to mention the rumors that started aboard Unity after its XO had a somewhat public disagreement with the captain and then went on ice. The science officer picked up on the silence. The main shift is that the fleet intentionally decelerated from 15% down to 7% of light speed a few years earlier than it needed to give us a better window for this test. It was decided the timetable for the symbolic arrival was too tight. The fleet is now 0.82 light years behind us and will reach its optimum braking distance 1/8 of a light year just over a decade from now. With that larger window in mind, we've also got a beachhead constructor fleet that should be able to get enough infrastructure going that the main fleet can more or less plug in on arrival and help us regain some lost time. A decade seems overly cautious, the Commodore said. I agree. Ah, the Commodore said, did you also get stuffed in a cryopod with new orders for being impatient too? I was wondering why the fleet science officer was here instead of back on Unity. Not exactly, the science officer said. You could say I was of two minds on the matter. The deputy engineer laughed. He had a copy of his brain and body made. He's back on Unity, or his copy is, he won't say which. Because it doesn't matter, the science officer said, unbothered. As testing another contingency plan, increasing our numbers more quickly when the fleet divides, if needed, and giving people an outlet if they want to stay behind to settle a system or travel on with the fleet. We had a lot of family breakup concerns back at Tau Ceti, as you know. For some people, being able to stay with your family while also choosing a different path is rather attractive. So now we're not just planning to divide the fleet occasionally, we'll be dividing individuals, eh? I take it one of you is going to stay with the fleet and the other will settle here, the Commodore asked. Not quite. Once we get settled here and I exchange notes with my, well, call it my brother, I'll be taking the beam array directly home to Earth. I'll actually get there faster than we got from Earth to Tau Ceti, or from Tau Ceti here. We anticipate a couple of small ships leaving as well, carrying people heading either back to Earth or to Tau Ceti. If this works, we should have new colonists arriving straight from Earth by the millions in just about 50 or 60 years. This raised a number of thoughts in the Commodore's mind, but he decided to stick to the mission. Walk us through the next steps. The engineer took that up. The basic plan remains. We begin to slow down using a mix of light sails, mag sails, and fusion drives, led by the automated portions of this expedition. They will essentially be crashing the local sun while beaming energy backward at the slower parts of our column, of which we are the last and largest element. We should have more than twice as many sails and ships as needed. Each element in the chain pushes those behind it, until eventually we can get some into stable solar orbit and use them to slow the rest of the vanguard down. Then we prepare to receive follow-up waves of automated pods, which will deploy sails only and arrive at intervals as fast as Unity can build them, which, based on their last report, 300 days old, was ahead of schedule. As she continued without pause, the fleet will then slow itself down in part by firing those pods out of large mass drivers. We deploy the solar arrays, use them to slow each incoming bundle, and add them to the beaming system until the fleet reaches just over 1/8 of a light year out, again in about a decade. By then, we hope to have 1 trillion gigawatts of beaming array, around 10 billion square kilometers, established around the Sun. That's 20 times the size of Earth, the science officer noted, though thinner than tinfoil, Kardashev 1.1 for power. How massive is the array? The Commodore asked. That big it should blow away in the solar wind. True, the science officer noted. They have enough guidance on the individual sails, which are far smaller, to tip sideways when not in use. No cross-section to blow away, and it cuts down on solar erosion too. We are hoping to add mass locally as part of the beachhead operation, as will help with lifetime and stability, but the bare-bones pods alone are coming in at a few billion tons, more than our entire Vanguard squadron, even including our slowdown fuel. The science officer nodded. Needless to say, that's basically all the fleet's remaining mass. They will start stripping out the majority of the forward shielding on the ships once the first slowdown is accomplished. They won't need as much, and they can start recycling into the pods and the enormous sails they'll need on their end. Contingencies, the Commodore asked. Several, the engineer said, but they depend on the failure mode. One option is to put some lenses back toward the fleet to extend the effective range of the beam, letting us use a weaker one. We won't really know which paths to pursue until things start going wrong. Most of them rely on establishing this beachhead and getting industry and raw materials going, though. She smiled thinly, and of course, all of that assumes we don't crash into the sun. But don't worry, the science officer added. We've been prototyping this in the fleet for decades while you were on ice. We've even been using a miniature version to send shuttles and cargo pods between fleet elements. It will work. We will safely slow down well outside 82G Eridani and enter orbit around a gas giant just beyond the frost line, Ion, in just over a month. And if it doesn't work, the Commodore asked, then, Commodore, you have just under a month to yell at me to get it fixed before we meet a fiery demise, says the engineer. The Beachhead. Needless to say, our brave Vanguard does not burn up, but it's useful to linger on that possibility for a moment, because it highlights something science fiction often glosses over, something that's only become clear to me over the years as we spent many episodes, both in this series and elsewhere, really digging into how interstellar settlements would actually work. And here's the key idea. Stopping is not a single action. It's a process that unfolds over years, across distances measured in light days, and through infrastructure that must work the first time, every time, with no opportunity for rehearsal. We've discussed beaming architecture in more detail in other episodes, along with concepts like massive interstellar relay chains, and even city-states built around them. So we'll skim some of that today, but I do want to walk through how this deployment works, because it helps to emphasize just how long and intricate the process really is, compared to the usual science fiction image of slamming on the brakes. When the Vanguard Squadron peeled away from Fleet Unity, it wasn't to arrive early in the way science fiction often imagines. They weren't racing ahead to plant a flag, claim a world, or set up domes and tents. Everyone already had a place to live back in the fleet. They'd been living there for decades and in considerable comfort. Instead, they were arriving early because deceleration itself is a form of construction. You don't slow down an incoming civilization by firing engines. You slow it down by building something massive and indispensable in its path. And that's exactly why Vanguard Squadron needs a different kind of commander than Unity does. Unity's captain is patient, long horizon, the sort of person you want holding the wheel when decisions take a century to pay off. Vanguard needs someone else, a frontier commodore with a little Benjamin Sisko in him, running an outpost on the edge of human space where impatience isn't a flaw, it's a survival trait. The Unity's former XO, the one who always was a little too eager to try faster options, even when they carried more risk, was a natural fit. At its core, this mission is a prototype, executed at full scale. In the future, there won't just be a single fleet following behind. There'll be entire waves of cryoships, habitation arcs, and cargo convoys departing from Earth at speeds too high to break from on their own, some perhaps only months behind the initial fleet, all forming a long, continuous chain. Done right, the chain could deliver billions of settlers into a new star system within just a few years of the first arrival. This is what a beachhead means at interstellar scale. Not a settlement, it's not a city, a colony, or even a place people expect to live for very long, though it will likely become all those soon enough. And there's nothing especially beach-like about this one. It's being carved into Clotho, one of the frozen moons of a gas giant Ion, where the only sea in sight is the water melting of the ice as tunnels are cut and the first caverns take shape. Ice-rich bodies were chosen over rocky walls for reasons that have nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with physics. These people have fusion reactors, so there's water, there's power, but more importantly, they just finished unfurling a beaming array that, small compared to what they'll assemble over the next decade, was still pushing tens, possibly hundreds of petawatts to slow a Vanguard fleet weighing on the order of 100 megatons through a 2G burn. Once the Vanguard is settled in, the array no longer needs to run continuously. It only has to come online briefly here and there to slow the next wave of incoming pods, and possibly speed some things out as well. One of the cheapest contingency options available is to use that same array to fire metal pods full of fusion fuel and critical life support ices in the opposite direction. That way, if the main fleet overruns the beachhead because the full beaming system can't be brought online in time, those ships can restock on propellant and fuel, either to slow down manually and turn back into the system, or to continue onward at a lower speed. Slower than planned, certainly, but no worse than their original mission to Tau Ceti. In a scenario like that, the beachhead would likely prioritize slowing passenger pods loaded with colonists and essential colonial infrastructure, while the fleet, in its far greater bulk, simply coasts onward to rendezvous with fuel pods that are staggered out in distance and speed. There are now more than 1 million people in the fleet. It's a disproportionately young population thanks to rapid growth, but it also includes people with centuries of accumulated experience. Most are in physical and mental condition that would make an Olympic athlete with a couple of PhDs feel inadequate. They can rely heavily on automation, probably more than they're entirely comfortable with, but turning loose advanced AGI to run nanobots and von Neumann probes is always an option. In other words, they have a great deal of margin for error, but they're also an extremely conservative society when it comes to risks, much like we are today compared to our ancestors. And that's the part we tend to skip in the pop culture version of First Landing. The Vanguard doesn't arrive and start building a city. They arrive and start building margin. Margin against radiation, margin against heat, margin against failure, margin against the possibility that your very first assumption about a star system, assumptions you've lived with for a century, are about to be edited by reality. Clotho, from a distance, is just a pale speck in the shadow of Ion's muted bands. Up close, it's a world of deep frost, thousands of meters of water ice over a rocky core, with faint mineral veining from ancient volcanic episodes. To most civilizations, it would be a desolate place. To a Garter fleet, it's prime real estate. Indeed, many were born on such a moon back when the fleet was in Tau Ceti and the ship just parked on one. The first and most counterintuitive decision the Vanguard made was where not to build. They didn't start with surface domes, orbital showpieces, or anything that might be seen. They didn't start by claiming anything, because you don't claim a star system with flags. You claim it with logistics. The first structures were not homes. They were interfaces. Power interfaces, converting stellar output and reactor heat into usable energy without cooking your own machines or destabilizing your thermal environment. Mass interfaces, turning ice and volatiles into propellant, shielding structural stock, and stored reserves without creating a lethal debris haze. Beam interfaces, capable of receiving, redirecting, and safely dissipating energy streams so large that overkill stops being a joke and becomes a design philosophy. Even that smaller beam that slowed the emissary down could have peeled a habitable planet like an apple, and it could roast a hostile or unsuspecting fleet just as easily. And that leads to the second, quiet inversion of the beachhead phase. At Tau Ceti, Unity built homes and social frameworks alongside industry because Tau Ceti was a deliberate stop. Eridani, at least in this moment, was not. The fleet was still inbound, still committed to a braking plan that would not forgive delays, and every human body you add too early is another hungry mouth for life support, another demand on redundancy. Here, population is a liability until infrastructure becomes an asset. So the beachhead is human light and automation heavy. Machines arrive first, then more machines, then the tools to build machines from local material. Humans follow only where judgment, adaptability, or oversight still beats automation. Progress is not measured in headcount, it's measured in watts, tons, and square kilometers of working hardware. People can wait, momentum cannot. In practice, it looks less like a heroic touchdown and more like an industrial organism establishing its organs. Fusion-powered cutters anchor onto Clotho's surface and start drilling down, not for romance, because the ice gives them what domes and radiation shelters on the surface never will: stability. Inside the ice, the temperature doesn't swing wildly every day-night cycle. Radiation drops off behind meters of mass. Micrometeoroids that would be catastrophic to a surface dome are reduced to harmless thuds, absorbed by a world-sized shield, and the ice itself provides the ultimate heatsink. In the early days, you don't build a city, you build a radiator. Tunnels branch outward in planned patterns that immediately start drifting as the real material responds. Ice isn't always clean. It has layers, voids, stresses, dust pockets, mineral seams. The first cutter that hits an unexpected brittle layer and sends hairline cracks racing outward teaches you why the beachhead is built around tolerance for error, not elegance. You don't just carve a hallway, you carve a thermal sink, a pressure boundary, a storage reservoir, and a place where you can bury a mistake without losing the mission. The early caverns are Spartan because Spartan is fast and fast matters. Few people live here, and for all they're used to greater luxury than a 21st century billionaire, they'd also handle hardships that would break a Navy SEAL. power nodes go in first. Heat has to go somewhere, and on an ice moon you can cheat. You can dump heat into the very world you're excavating. Coolant loops, heat exchangers, and insulated pits turn Clotho itself into a buffer. That's not just convenience, it's protection against the kind of thermal runaway that can kill an outpost in silence. If reactor hiccups or load spikes, the moon takes a punch. Only after the caves are safe do they start becoming useful. Storage chambers, machine shops, communication bays, fuel processing lines that crack water into hydrogen and oxygen. Not because you're going to run chemical rockets everywhere, though you might have a few atmosphere-capable shuttles later, because hydrogen and oxygen are fundamental currency out here. They are reaction mass, life support, feedstock, and a buffer against every future emergency. Clotho's ice is nearly pure water, a fusion engineer's dream, and the Vanguard treats it the way a Navy treats a coaling station, not glamorous but decisive. Above, in orbit, the arriving beachhead becomes visible only as logistics at first. Beacons, relays, navigation references. That multi-megaton fleet that was a tiny Vanguard still contains hundreds of shuttles that dwarf the ones we used to launch post-Apollo. Traffic lanes are defined by delta-V economics rather than straight lines, because in a system this big, the cheapest path is often not the shortest. Freighters begin running between Clotho and the rest of Ion's domain as soon as it's safe, because the third key to surviving the beachhead is not having to do everything in one place. That's why the name matters too. Aeon isn't just a gas giant, it's a deep time anchor, a gravitational hub around which an outer system civilization can build with less fuel and more flexibility. And once you start treating the system as a network instead of a destination, it's obvious you don't want Clotho to do the job of metals mine. So Lachesis comes next. Lachesis Atropos. Where Clotho is forgiving, Lachesis is hard and uncompromising. Denser, rockier, metal-rich, with nickel iron and silica strata close enough to the surface to make an industrial planner's pulse rise. The Vanguard doesn't colonize it at first, they instrument it. Survey drones and prospecting packages map seams, test structural integrity, and identify safe anchoring points for early mining rigs. Then come the crawlers, the rakes, the smelters. Not grand factories at first, but rugged, modular units designed to survive vacuum dust and simple mechanical failure without a human hand hovering nearby. This is where the beachhead starts to look like something bigger than a bunker in the ice, because once you can turn a local ore into usable metal, you can stop treating every kilogram of your own hull as sacred. You can repair with local stock, expand with local stock, start building the kind of skeletal framework that lets you assemble larger machines instead of nursing along the ones you brought. Now you can repair solar collectors for the beaming ray and build those resupply pods we spoke of. And you can begin experimenting. There's a temptation in any first settlement to treat as a museum piece. Preserve the original hardware, keep everything clean, don't risk the precious systems. A Garner fleet cannot afford that sentimentality. It's not just building a base, it's rehearsing the next base while it builds this one. So on Lachesis, alongside the steady grind of turning rock into metal, the Vanguard's engineers start stress testing tether materials and structural composites, things that might eventually matter for order infrastructure around Elysium, the most Earth-like body in the system, or for anchoring large-scale construction hubs above Clotho. Not because they are building a space elevator tomorrow, because their tomorrow arrives faster when you try to catch a fleet that's still moving at relativistic speed. Which brings us to Atropos. Atropos is not chosen because it's convenient. It's chosen because it's alive, in the geological sense. Cryovolcanic, venting plumes rich in nitrogen and exotic volatiles from fissures that throw their contents into space. A new star system, nitrogen is not a nice-to-have. It's the quiet bottleneck behind agriculture, atmospheric management, and any serious attempt to build ecosystems that don't feel like life support systems wearing a plant costume. A real ecosystem, not a garden park or hydroponics bay. Harvesting Atropos is an elegant kind of cheating. Instead of digging and hauling, you catch what the moon is already throwing away. Collection rigs hover on low thrust drives, dip into plumes, compress and separate the gases, and transfer them to tankers waiting in orbit. It's industrial fishing in a jet of nitrogen-rich vapor, and it turns a hostile exotic environment into something usable with minimal risk. And now we can start making new habitats for people and our ecosystems to inhabit on arrival. By this point, our beachhead is no longer one location. It's a triangle of roles like it was in Tau Ceti, if a bit different since the worlds are different. Clotho has the ice and fuel crossroads, Lachesis has the metal's backbone, Atropos is the volatile supply, and around all three is the growing mesh of traffic lanes, beacons, relay nodes, and rendezvous points, and that's what the Vanguard is really building while the main fleet coasts towards its optimum braking distance. Not a city, but a system of interfaces, a supply chain, a way of turning wilderness into an infrastructure map. They have about a decade to get things ready. There's no such thing as ready out here. Goals shift, benchmarks move, assumptions get revised as uncertainties are stripped away and new ones appear. And this is where the principle that speed is the enemy really starts to bite. It sounds backwards. You think the dangerous part was the high-speed transit, and that once you're finally near your destination you can relax. But speed magnifies mistakes, and at interstellar velocities, those mistakes don't just compound, they propagate forward in time, constraining every decision you haven't made yet. Oversizing stops being wasteful and becomes ethical. There's no such thing as too much brute force. Redundancy ceases being a luxury and becomes the only responsible way to put lives on the far end of a decade-long plan. Interstellar settlement is wildly inefficient by everyday standards. These ships burn through staggering amounts of raw material while economizing for time, not mass, because the materials they consume, vast as they are trivial compared to what the system contains, or even what the star itself expends. Every second, the star fuses millions of tons of hydrogen into helium and blows more mass away in stellar wind than the fleet will ever use. Worrying about material efficiency before infrastructure is established is like worrying about your electric bill while the fire pump is still putting out the house fire. So, ahead of schedule becomes a warning phase, not a compliment. Because the real enemy of the beachhead isn't dramatic catastrophe, it's small deviations, quiet ones that force you to spend your one truly scarce resource, time. Time you didn't budget for, fixing problems you didn't know you were going to have. That's why even as they drill and smelt and harvest, the Vanguard's instruments are working overtime. They're measuring the star, not poetically but mechanically, output, variability, stellar wind density, dust distribution, microhazards in the outer system, orbital resonances around Aeon and its moons that might turn a safe parking orbit into a long-term problem. These are not details you need to admire a system. They are the details you need if you are about to hang a trillion-gigawatt beaming architecture near the star and trust it with the fate of a civilization. And this is where decades of planning collide with the oldest truth in spaceflight. The universe is under no obligation to match your spreadsheets. Most corrections are not catastrophic, they are subtle. A dust density that nudges your braking profile, a fluctuation in stellar output that shifts your thermal margins, a new tech from home that lets you do something better, a resonance that slowly presets an orbit into a debris field you couldn't resolve from light years away. None of these in the mission. All of them matter. Because when you are slowing down a civilization, small uncertainties don't stay small for long. So the beachhead grows with deliberate humility, as if a module will underperform because it will, as if one day they'll discover that a perfectly reasonable assumption was wrong, not disastrously so, but just enough to force a change, and to make sure the system can bend without breaking when that day comes. All the while, 10 years behind them, the main fleet is still inbound. That fact shapes everything. How many people you wake, what you build first, how much risk you tolerate, and how much you avoid. Because the beachhead's job isn't to become the capital of Eridani. It's to survive long enough and build enough that fleet unity can arrive and plug in without having to reinvent the system under pressure. When the fleet reaches its 1/8 light-year braking distance and commits the bulk of its remaining mass to incoming pods and sails, there is no undo button. The decision becomes load-bearing. Either the interfaces exist, or they don't. Either the system catches the fleet, or it doesn't. Which is why Clotho's tunnels matter, why Lachesis' smelters matter, why Atropos' plumes matter. They aren't side quests while we wait for the real colonization to begin. At interstellar scale, the first colony isn't a place you live. It's the machinery that makes arriving alive possible. Today we're looking at establishing a foothold beyond our solar system and what it takes to hold on to it. Because getting there is only half the challenge. Staying there means building systems that can endure isolation, uncertainty, and long delays, where help might be centuries away and failure is not easily repaired. If you enjoy deep dives into science fiction worlds and explore those long-term expansions, check out Quinn's Ideas, where he examines stories like Dune and the forces shaping civilizations over time, from politics to survival strategies. And whether you're settling another star or holding on to Earth itself, survival is never guaranteed. My exclusive, Surviving a New Ice Age, looks at how a civilization endures when environments push back, and what it takes to stay resilient over the long term. Nebula is where every episode of SFIA premieres early and ad-free, alongside years of monthly exclusives and content from hundreds of creators like Quinn's Ideas. Right now, Nebula is offering 40% off lifetime access, just $300 for permanent access to everything on the platform. Use my link with a QR code to get that deal, and there's also 50% off an annual plan. That's just $30 for the whole year. Arrival. So the long glide is finally ending. As Fleet Unity enters its final braking phase, it isn't arriving at a silent tomb of ice. It's arriving at a working system. The beacons around Aeon are lit. The tunnels on Clotho are pressured. Lachesis is producing metal. Atropos is feeding the volatile chain. And the first pieces of that trillion-gigawatt beaming architecture are already reaching out to meet the fleet. But arrival doesn't mean reunion. Not really. The Vanguard has spent a decade becoming Eridani locals, solving problems with no audience and no backup, while the millions aboard the Unity are still carrying the habits and expectations of a 70-year voyage. They are about to meet a version of themselves that is already adapted to the destination, and the real test begins now, because this is the moment the expedition becomes load-bearing. Once the fleet commits to braking, there's no reversing the decision without paying an obscene cost in time, mass, and lives. The beachhead either catches the fleet or it doesn't. Because the beachhead was never meant to be home, it was meant to make home possible. Next time, in Fleet Unity, the Eridani expedition, Worlds, Moons, and New Frontiers, we'll look at what happens when the fleet finally arrives. The first decades of permanent settlement, the birth of the Aeon shipyards, the first steps toward Elysium, and what a Garner fleet does when it has to decide which seeds to plant and which ones to carry back into the dark. But ultimately, the beachhead wasn't the destination, it was just the landing gear.